Leah Mercado thought her secret life in Dubai was carefully hidden, until Daniel Reyes vanished without a trace and every lie she had told began pointing straight back at her. On the surface, Liza Mercado appeared to have a stable and respectable life that many people quietly envied. She worked as a Filipina flight attendant for an international airline, which gave her access to different countries, hotels, and experiences that felt far away from her modest beginnings. Her husband, Daniel Reyes, lived a much quieter life. He worked in logistics, followed routines strictly, and preferred stability over excitement. When they first married, people around them believed they were a strong match, balancing each other's personalities in a simple but steady way. Over time, however, that balance started to weaken. Daniel's work kept him grounded in one place, while Liza's job constantly pulled her across time zones and continents. At first, they tried to manage the distance with trust and communication. But slowly the conversations became shorter and less meaningful. Small misunderstandings began to grow into silence. Days passed without real connection, and emotional closeness started to fade without either of them openly addressing it. Liza often returned home tired, carrying the invisible weight of long flights and unfamiliar cities. Daniel, on the other hand, spent more evenings alone, thinking about how their life had changed. He noticed she smiled less when she was home and seemed distracted even when physically present. The warmth that once defined their marriage had been replaced by routine interactions that felt forced and distant. Despite this, neither of them openly admitted that something was wrong. Instead, they continued living side by side, holding on to the idea that things would eventually improve on their own. But silence has a way of growing heavier over time, and in their case, it slowly turned into emotional separation. During one of her international was assigned a layover in Dubai. She had been there before, but this time felt different. She was more emotionally vulnerable than usual, carrying frustration from her strained marriage and exhaustion from constant travel. That particular stop would become the turning point of her life, although she did not realize it at the time. In the lobby of a luxury hotel, she encountered a man whose presence stood out immediately. He was calm, confident, and surrounded by an aura of wealth and influence that felt unfamiliar compared to her everyday world. The meeting was brief, but it left a lasting impression. Something in that moment quietly shifted, setting off a chain of decisions that would later pull her into a situation far more complicated than she could have imagined. What began in Dubai as a brief and forgettable encounter soon turned into something far more persistent in Liza Mercado's life. After returning to her flight schedule, she expected the memory of the wealthy stranger to fade. Instead, it lingered in her thoughts during long flights and quiet hotel stays. The attention she received from passengers and colleagues no longer felt as significant compared to that brief moment in the luxury hotel lobby. It created a strange emotional gap that she could not easily explain to herself. During her next layover in Dubai, the encounter repeated itself, but this time it was not accidental. The Dubai billionaire had made efforts to find her through connections within the hospitality and aviation circles he often moved through. He was known for his influence in real estate and high-end investments, and he was used to getting access to people and situations that interested him. Liza, to him, represented something different from the world he usually lived in. She was not part of his business environment or elite social circle, which made her attention feel more personal and unpredictable. Their meetings slowly became more frequent and structured around him. Layovers. At first, they were simple conversations in public spaces, but over time they shifted into private dinners in exclusive locations. Liza found herself exposed to a lifestyle that contrasted sharply with her own reality. Luxury cars, high-end hotels, and carefully arranged experiences began to replace her usual routine of airports and crew schedules. Emotionally, she started to drift further away from her husband. Daniel Reyes remained unaware of the full extent of what was happening, but he began noticing subtle changes. Liza became more guarded with her phone, less transparent about her timing, and emotionally distant even during short periods at home. When questioned, she avoided direct answers, keeping conversations brief and controlled. The billionaire, on the other hand, grew increasingly invested in the connection. What started as interest developed into possession. He began to shape expectations around Liza's availability and attention, gradually introducing the idea that her current life was temporary and could be replaced. His influence was not loud or aggressive at first, but steady and persuasive, slowly narrowing her sense of choice. Liza now existed between two realities that no longer felt compatible. One was familiar but emotionally empty, and the other was exciting but uncertain in its direction. Each decision she made in secret deepened her involvement, making it harder to step back without consequences. What once felt like an escape from emotional distance was quietly turning into a situation built on secrecy, dependency, and growing tension that neither side fully acknowledged. As Liza Mercado's secret life in Dubai continued, the emotional weight of her double existence became harder to manage. What once felt thrilling and new started to feel unstable and demanding. The Dubai billionaire, who had initially shown charm and patience, began revealing a more controlling side of his personality. He expected consistency, exclusivity, and quick decisions about her future. For him, uncertainty was not acceptable, especially in matters he considered important. Liza, however, found herself increasingly trapped between two lives. In one, she was still Daniel Ray's wife, bound by marriage and history. In the other, she was being pulled into a world of luxury and influence that demanded she let go of her past completely. Each time she returned home, the contrast between these two realities grew sharper. Daniel's quiet presence reminded her of responsibility and familiarity, while Dubai represented escape and possibility, but also pressure. Daniel began noticing that something fundamental had changed. Liza was no longer fully present when she was home. Her attention drifted easily, and her explanations about her schedule became less convincing. Small inconsistencies in timing, travel details, and emotional behavior started forming a pattern he could not ignore. Instead of confronting her directly with assumptions, he began observing more carefully, noting every irregularity in silence. At the same time, the billionaire's expectations intensified. He began discussing a future that required complete separation from her current marriage. These discussions were not casual suggestions but firm directions disguised as choices. Liza felt the pressure increase each time she met him, as though her life was being slowly reshaped without her fully deciding it herself. When she hesitated or avoided commitment, the atmosphere between them shifted into tension. The situation became emotionally unstable from all directions. Liza was being pulled forward by one life and held back by another. Daniel's quiet suspicion created distance at home, while the billionaire's demands created urgency abroad. Neither side fully understood how deeply entangled she had become in a situation that was no longer simple or controllable. Her mental state began to fracture under this pressure. She started relying on secrecy as a way to maintain balance, but secrecy only created more instability. Every lie required another, and every delay increased tension on both sides of her life. What had started as emotional escape was now turning into emotional confinement. Liza was no longer simply choosing between two men or two lifestyles. She was caught in a tightening web of expectation, suspicion, and pressure that was closing in from both directions, leaving her increasingly isolated in decisions she no longer fully controlled. The situation reached its breaking point when Daniel Ray's suddenly disappeared under circumstances that immediately raised concern. At first, those close to him assumed he had left temporarily after a marital conflict or personal frustration. He was not someone who acted impulsively, but the growing tension in his marriage made that explanation seem possible to some. However, as hours turned into days, uncertainty replaced assumptions, and concern quickly escalated into alarm. Liza Mercado report. He had him missing, but her behavior during the early stages of the investigation drew quiet attention. Her statements were emotionally restrained, and certain details about the timeline did not fully align with basic verification of Daniel's last known movements. Authorities began reviewing his phone records, financial activity, and recent communications, looking for any indication of planned travel or voluntary disappearance. Nothing suggested that he had intended to leave without informing anyone. As investigators dug deeper, they began noticing inconsistencies surrounding Liza's own schedule during that critical period. Her travel records showed overlapping timelines that required closer examination. Some of her explanations about flight routes and layovers did not match confirmed airline data. While none of this immediately proved wrongdoing, it created enough doubt to expand the scope of the investigation. Attention soon shifted toward her repeated travel connections to Dubai. Each visit, once seen as part of her normal work routine, now appeared more significant in light of the growing suspicions. Digital evidence began revealing communication patterns that linked her to individuals outside her professional environment. Among these was the Dubai billionaire, whose identity surfaced through financial and private correspondence channels. As pressure from investigators increased, the carefully maintained structure of secrecy around Liza's life began to weaken. The billionaire, sensing potential exposure, started distancing himself from any involvement. His communication became limited, indirect, and eventually inconsistent. He appeared more focused on protecting his reputation than maintaining any personal connection. Liza found herself increasingly isolated as both sides of her life began collapsing at once. At home, she was under scrutiny from investigators. Abroad, the influence that once felt powerful was now fading into silence. Every attempt to clarify her mission only led to more questions, and every inconsistency deepened suspicion. What initially appeared to be a missing person case gradually shifted into a more serious criminal investigation. Evidence was still being gathered, but the direction of the case was becoming clearer. Daniel's disappearance was no longer viewed as random or voluntary. Instead, it was being examined as part of a chain of events involving secrecy, hidden relationships, and escalating tension that had finally reached a point of irreversible consequence. As the investigation reached its final stage, the full picture of what happened to Daniel Reyes began to emerge in fragments that were difficult to ignore. What had once looked like a simple missing person case slowly transformed into a complex web of hidden relationships, emotional manipulation, and carefully concealed actions. Each layer uncovered by investigators added more weight to the suspicion that Daniel's disappearance was not accidental or voluntary. Liza Mercado's double life became the central focus of the case. Her repeated travels to Dubai, her private communications, and her growing emotional distance from her husband formed a pattern that investigators could no longer dismiss. Financial records, location data, and recovered messages helped establish connections that placed her in situations far beyond what she had initially admitted. While she continued to maintain that she was not directly responsible for any harm, the evidence showed that her actions and decisions had created circumstances that led to irreversible consequences. The Dubai billionaire also came under intense scrutiny. His involvement with Liza was no longer seen as a distant personal affair, but as a key element in the chain of events. However, when questioned, he maintained distance from the core allegations, carefully separating himself from direct responsibility. Despite his influence and access to resources, the investigation revealed that he had taken deliberate steps to avoid legal exposure once the situation began to collapse. As pressure increased, Liza's emotional state deteriorated further. The reality she had tried to manage through secrecy and avoidance finally collapsed completely. The two worlds she had been living in no longer existed separately. Instead, they had merged into a single situation defined by investigation reports, public attention, and irreversible outcomes. There was no longer any space for control or negotiation. The case concluded with findings that confirmed Daniel Reyes had died as a result of circumstances connected to betrayal, emotional conflict, and actions taken in secrecy. While no single moment explained everything, the combination of decisions made over time created a path that led to tragedy. The investigation emphasized how hidden relationships and growing pressure between individuals can escalate beyond intention when left unchecked. In the aftermath, Liza's life was permanently altered. Her reputation, career, and personal freedom were all affected by the legal consequences and public reaction that followed. The Dubai billionaire's image also suffered, as scrutiny over his involvement remained part of the wider narrative surrounding the case. What remained was not a story of romance or ambition, but a cautionary outcome shaped by secrecy and emotional instability. A marriage that once seemed ordinary had ended in loss, and a chain of decisions driven by desire and pressure had led to a point where nothing could be reversed or undone.